The sterile white corridor of the emergency ward stretched endlessly before Marco Santoro, each fluorescent light above him humming like a death march. His black suit jacket was torn at the shoulder, streaked with dust and blood that was not his own. His hands, scarred from years of handling things most men would never touch, trembled. He had driven straight from the burning wreckage, ignoring the police barricades, the shouting officers, the chaos of fire trucks and ambulances converging on what remained of his family's car. Now there was only silence and the sharp chemical smell of antiseptic that burned his throat. A nurse approached, her footsteps hesitant on the linoleum. She was young, too young to know who he was, too inexperienced to hide the fear in her eyes when she finally recognized the name on her clipboard. "Mr. Santoro?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Your wife, she's still in surgery." Still, the word felt like a knife twisting. Marco turned sharply, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her take a step back. "And my children?" His voice came out rougher than he intended, cracking at the edges like old stone. The nurse looked down at her shoes. Her silence was an answer in itself. Marco's world tilted sideways. He heard her mouth forming words, saw her lips moving, but the sound did not reach him. Somewhere in the distance, a machine beeped steadily, marking time that no longer mattered. "I'm sorry," she finally managed. "They didn't survive the impact." The explosion was concentrated on the back seat where, he held up one hand, stopping her. He did not need details. He had seen the car, twisted metal and broken glass scattered across the intersection. He had smelled the gasoline and burned rubber. He had known the moment Rocco's panic call came through that his world had just ended. This was not an accident. Marco Santoro did not believe in accidents. Someone had placed that bomb. Someone had targeted his family, and he would find out who. But first, he had to survive the next few minutes. He found himself sitting in a cold metal chair, though he did not remember walking to it. His expensive Italian leather shoes were scuffed, covered in debris from the street. Sophia's laughter still echoed in his ears, her high musical voice from that morning when she had climbed into his lap to show him a drawing. His son, Luca Jr., only 4 years old, asking when Papa would teach him to drive like the big cars. He should have been with them. He should have been in that car. But he had sent them ahead with Enzo while he finished a meeting, believing the separate car would keep them safer. His caution had killed them. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. When the doctor emerged from the surgical wing, still in his blood-stained scrubs, Marco already knew. One look at the man's exhausted face was enough. "Mr. Santoro," the doctor began, his voice professionally neutral, but his eyes giving him away. "We did everything we could. The internal bleeding was too severe. I'm very sorry, your wife didn't make it." The machines behind the swinging doors fell silent. That sound, that single endless tone, carved itself into Marco's bones. He would hear it for the rest of his life. He did not scream. He did not collapse. He simply stopped existing as the man he had been. Marco Santoro, husband and father, died in that hallway. Only the shell remained. The funeral took place 3 days later under a pale gray sky that refused to rain. The private cemetery on the Santoro estate, filled with men in dark suits, women in black dresses, all wearing expressions of carefully controlled grief. In Marco's world, even sorrow had rules. 3 coffins stood before him, one adult size, draped in white roses, 2 unbearably small, covered in lilies. Sophia had loved lilies. Father Dominic spoke words about eternal rest and God's mercy. Marco heard none of it. He stood like carved stone, his expression blank, his eyes fixed on those 3 boxes that held everything he had ever loved. Behind him, Rocco and Enzo stood silent guard, their faces hard with barely contained rage. They knew what Marco knew. This had been a message, a declaration of war. And war was coming. But first he had to put his family in the ground. When the service ended and the first shovel of earth fell onto Elena's coffin, Marco turned and walked away. He did not wait for the rest. He could not watch his children be buried. The days that followed blurred together like ink in water. His associates handled the investigation quietly, tracking down the men responsible. Marco let them work. Vengeance would come, but it required patience. Right now he had none. He moved through his routines mechanically. He met with his captains in the back room of Santoro's, the restaurant his grandfather had built 50 years ago. He signed papers. He gave orders. His voice remained steady, his decisions sound. But inside he was hollow. The mansion on the hill overlooking the desert became a mausoleum. He walked its marble halls like a ghost, avoiding certain rooms, certain corners, where memories waited like traps. The nursery where Sophia used to play. The study where Luca Jr. would try to copy his father's paperwork with crayons. He locked their rooms after the first week, sealed them like tombs. Everything remained exactly as they had left it. Sophia's drawings still taped to the walls, Luca Jr.'s toy cars lined up on the shelf, their beds made, waiting for children who would never sleep in them again. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, knew better than to touch those doors. She cleaned around them, silent and efficient, never asking questions. The staff learned quickly that Mr. Santoro did not speak about his family. The subject was closed, buried as deep as the bodies in the cemetery. Women came and went in those early years. Associates' daughters, socialites seeking the dangerous appeal of a man like Marco Santoro. He let them try. He went through the motions of dates and dinners and meaningless conversations. But his heart remained locked behind the same doors that held his children's rooms. After a while, they stopped trying. Word spread quietly through the circles that mattered. Marco Santoro was untouchable. Not because he was dangerous, though he was, but because he was dead inside. You could not reach a man who no longer believed in warmth. 10 years passed like water through cupped hands. Marco watched seasons change from the windows of Santoro's restaurant, where he conducted his business now instead of the legitimate office he had once maintained. The back room with its dark wood paneling and dim amber lighting became his throne room, his confessional, his cage. He grew older but not softer. Gray touched his temples. Lines appeared around his eyes. His hands, already scarred, collected new marks from new conflicts. But his expression remained the same. Controlled. Empty. Dead. On the 10th anniversary of the bombing, Marco stood alone in the family cemetery as the sun set over the Nevada desert. The sky burned orange and gold, beautiful and indifferent. The 3 marble headstones before him were immaculate, maintained weekly by staff who knew better than to let a single weed grow near the Santoro graves. Elena Santoro, beloved wife and mother, Sophia Santoro, our little light, Luca Santoro Jr., our joy. Marco said nothing. There were no words left. He had screamed them all into the void years ago, when grief was still fresh enough to feel. Now there was only the quiet, constant ache of absence. He heard footsteps on the path behind him, but did not turn. Only one man would approach him here. "You're early this year," Father Dominic said quietly, coming to stand beside him. The old priest wore his simple black cassock, his hands clasped behind his back. "I wanted to be alone with them." "You're always alone with them, Marco. That's the problem." Marco's jaw tightened. "Don't start." "I've been your confessor for 20 years, Father Dominic continued, his voice gentle but firm. "I buried your wife and children. I've watched you bury yourself alongside them. When does it end?" "It doesn't. It has to." The priest gestured to the graves. "This is grief, Marco, not devotion. Grief that has calcified into something else, something that's keeping you from living." "I don't want to live," Marco said flatly. "I exist. That's enough." "Is it?" Father Dominic challenged. "Is this what Elena would have wanted? You, locked away in that restaurant, surrounded by men who fear you, conducting business in the shadows? You sleeping in that house that's become a shrine to pain?" "Don't speak of what she would have wanted," Marco said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "You don't know. I knew her, Marco. I married you both, and I know she would be heartbroken to see what you've become." Marco turned away, his hands curling into fists at his sides. The gold wedding band on his left hand caught the dying light. He had never removed it, would never remove it. "Why are you here, Father?" he asked tiredly. "Because someone has to reach you," Dominic said, "before you're too far gone to come back." "I'm already gone." "No," the priest said firmly. "You're still here, still breathing, still making choices. That means something. It means I'm cursed to keep existing when I should have died with them." Father Dominic sighed, a sound full of old sadness. He had heard these words before, in different forms, year after year. Your heart didn't die with them, Marco, he said quietly. You just buried it, locked it away in those sealed rooms and that controlled silence you wrap around yourself. But it's still there, still beating, still capable of feeling something other than this endless nothing. I don't want to feel anything else, Marco said. Feeling means hurting. I've had enough of hurt. So you choose numbness instead. Is that truly living? Marco said nothing. The sun had almost set now, the sky fading from gold to purple to the deep blue of approaching night. Stars were beginning to appear, cold and distant. What would you have me do? He asked finally, still not looking at the priest. Live, Father Dominic said simply. Not just exist, live. Find something to anchor you back to the world. Not to replace what you lost, but to honor it. Elena and your children wouldn't want you like this. Frozen in the moment they left. They're dead because of what I am, Marco said, his voice barely audible. Because someone wanted to hurt me and use them to do it. How do I honor that? How do I live knowing my life killed them? By not letting their deaths kill you too, the priest replied. By choosing to build something instead of letting the grief consume everything. Marco turned finally, his dark eyes meeting Dominic's. I don't know how to do that anymore. Then learn, Dominic said. Start small. Open one door you have kept closed. Take one step back toward the living. You don't have to do it alone. Marco wanted to argue, to push back against the words that threatened to crack the careful walls he had built. But he was tired. So tired of the weight he carried, the silence he maintained, the endless gray days that bled into each other without meaning. I'll think about it, he said finally, knowing it was a lie. Father Dominic nodded, accepting the weak promise for what it was. He placed one hand briefly on Marco's shoulder, a gesture of blessing and farewell, then walked back down the path toward the gates. Marco stood alone in the cemetery as full darkness fell. The desert air grew cold, carrying the scent of sage and dust. He looked down at the three graves, the marble pale in the starlight. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry I'm still here when you are not. I'm sorry I don't know how to let you go. The graves offered no answer. They never did. Eventually he turned and walked back to his car, the black Alfa Romeo waiting like a patient shadow. Rocco stood beside it, having kept watch from a distance. Home, boss? Rocco asked quietly. Marco thought about the mansion, the locked rooms, the silence that would greet him. No, he said. The restaurant, I have work to do. Because work was safe, work required no emotions, no vulnerability, no risk of feeling anything at all. Rocco nodded and opened the door. Marco slid into the back seat and the car pulled away from the cemetery, leaving the dead to their rest. But as they drove through the dark Nevada night, Marco found himself thinking about Father Dominic's words, about living instead of existing, about doors that remain locked and hearts that still beat despite everything. He pushed the thoughts away. Grief was his companion now, his constant shadow. It was all he had left of his family. Letting it go felt like betrayal. But somewhere deep inside, buried beneath layers of numbness and control, a part of him wondered if the priest was right. If perhaps staying frozen in that moment 10 years ago was not honoring his family at all. It was just another way of dying. And he had promised Elena, in the moments before she slipped away, that he would keep living. For Sophia, for Luca Jr., for all of them. He had broken that promise the moment he sealed those doors. The question was whether he had the courage to open them again. Marco stared out the window at the passing desert, his reflection ghostly in the glass. Behind him, somewhere in the darkness, three graves stood silent witness to a man who had survived but stopped living. Perhaps Father Dominic was right. Perhaps it was time to choose differently. But not tonight. Tonight he would return to his restaurant, to his business, to the safe numbness of routine. Tomorrow, he told himself, knowing it was another lie. Always tomorrow. The conversation with Father Dominic echoed in Marco's mind for days after the cemetery visit. He tried to ignore it, burying himself deeper in work, in meetings that stretched late into the night, in the comfortable numbness of routine. But the priest's words had planted something that refused to stay buried. Find something to anchor you back to the world. Marco sat alone in his office at Santoro's, the private room on the second floor where he conducted the real business of his organization. Dark wood paneling absorbed what little light came from the amber-shaded lamps. The air smelled of aged leather and the faint ghost of cigar smoke. A crystal glass of whiskey sat untouched on his desk, catching the lamplight like liquid gold. Below him, the restaurant hummed with evening service. The sound was distant, muffled, a reminder that life continued even when you stopped participating in it. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come," Marco said without looking up from the papers before him. Father Dominic entered, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had known Marco long enough to ignore the dangerous reputation. He settled into the chair across from the desk without waiting for an invitation. "You've been avoiding me," Dominic said. "I've been busy." "You're always busy. It's your favorite excuse." The priest leaned back, studying Marco with eyes that had witnessed too many confessions to be fooled by surface appearances. "But that's not why I'm here." Marco finally looked up. "Then why are you here, Father?" "I have a suggestion, something you should consider before you seal yourself away completely." "I'm listening." Dominic paused, choosing his words carefully. "You need something to live for, Marco, not to replace what you lost. Never that, but something to honor their memory, a reason to keep your heart beating beyond simple survival." "We've had this conversation, and we'll keep having it until you hear me," Dominic said firmly. "I'm not suggesting you forget Elena and the children. I'm suggesting you remember them by living the kind of life they would have wanted for you. A life with meaning, with purpose, with family." Marco's hand tightened on the whiskey glass. "I had a family. They're buried on the hill, and they would want you to build another," Dominic said quietly. "Not to replace them, but to continue, to create life from all this death, to prove that love survives grief." "What are you suggesting exactly?" The priest leaned forward. "Marriage, children, a second chance at the life that was taken from you." Marco laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Marriage, you think I should just find someone and pretend the last 10 years didn't happen? Pretend I'm not broken beyond repair?" "I think you should stop pretending you're as dead as you act," Dominic countered. "You're still here, Marco, still breathing, still capable of making choices that matter. The question is whether you have the courage to try." "I buried that courage with my children." "No," Dominic said. "You locked it away, like everything else you're afraid to face." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken truths heavy between them. "Even if I wanted to," Marco said finally, his voice tired. "Who would want this? A man who can't sleep without nightmares? Who keeps his dead children's rooms locked like shrines? Who runs an organization most people cross the street to avoid?" "Someone practical," Dominic said. "Someone who understands that marriages can be built on partnership instead of passion. Someone looking for security, for purpose, for a life with meaning. Someone brave enough to see past the walls you've built." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple, but it's possible." The priest stood, preparing to leave. "There's a charity fundraiser next week. Private, exclusive. The kind of event where people still remember you exist beyond these walls. Go. Be seen. Let the world know Marco Santoro hasn't completely disappeared." "I have no interest in being seen." "Then do it for Elena," Dominic said, his voice softening. "Do it for Sophia and Luca Jr. Do it because they deserve better than a father who stopped living when they died." The words struck deeper than Marco wanted to admit. He stared at the priest, searching for anger but finding only exhaustion. "I'll think about it," he said. This time it was not entirely a lie. The fundraiser took place at the Bellagio, in one of the private ballrooms reserved for events where discretion was more valuable than publicity. Marco arrived late, Rocco at his side, both men in dark suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The room glittered with crystal and gold, the chandeliers casting warm light over men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns. Conversations floated through the air, punctuated by laughter that sounded foreign to Marco's ears. He had forgotten what joy looked like in groups. "You want to leave already?" Rocco observed quietly. "Yes." "Father Dominic said you had to stay at least an hour." Marco shot him a look. You're taking orders from priests now? When they're right, boss. Rocco's scarred face creased slightly in what might have been a smile. Besides, won't kill you to pretend to be human for 60 minutes. Marco moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, nodding to those who recognized him, ignoring those who did not. He accepted a glass of whiskey from a passing waiter, but did not drink it. The glass was simply something to hold, a prop to complete the illusion of participation. He was planning his exit, calculating exactly how long Father Dominic would accept as trying when he saw her. She stood near the far windows, partially separated from the main crowd. Her gown was a soft champagne color that caught the light like liquid gold. Simple but elegant, the kind of understated wealth that spoke louder than ostentation. Her dark hair fell in loose waves past her shoulders, and her skin glowed warm brown under the chandeliers. But it was her expression that caught him. She wore no mask of false enthusiasm, no performative charm. She looked, for lack of a better word, real, present, alive in a way that most people in this room were not. Their eyes met across the space, and something flickered in her gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or assessment. She held his look for a moment longer than politeness required, then turned back to her conversation. "That's Amber Justine," Rocco murmured beside him. "Philanthropist. Old money, but she actually uses it for something besides parties. Runs 3 charities focused on children's welfare." Marco watched her excuse herself from her conversation and moved toward him, not with the calculated approach of someone seeking advantage, but with the direct purpose of someone who had made a decision. "Mr. Santoro," she said when she reached him, her voice clear and confident, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Neither did I," he replied honestly. Her lips curved slightly. "Then we're both surviving the evening under protest." He tilted his head, studying her. Most people around him either fawned or whispered. She did neither. "You don't seem like someone who does things under protest." "I don't enjoy these events," she admitted. "But sometimes visibility is the price of funding the work that actually matters." "Practical. I prefer effective," she countered. For the first time in years, Marco felt the faint stirring of interest. Not attraction exactly, though she was undeniably beautiful. Something else. Curiosity about a person who seemed unimpressed by the reputation that preceded him. "You know who I am," he said. It was not a question. "Everyone knows who you are, Mr. Santoro." She met his eyes directly. "The question is whether you're as dangerous as the story suggests, or just as sad." The blunt honesty caught him off guard. "Excuse me?" "I've heard the stories," Amber continued, her tone neither accusing nor sympathetic, simply factual. "About your family, about what happened, about how you've spent the last 10 years locked away from the world. So I'm curious whether the man standing before me is the dangerous crime boss everyone whispers about, or just a father who never recovered from grief." Marco should have been angry, should have ended the conversation with one of the cold looks that sent most people scattering. Instead, he found himself answering honestly. "Perhaps both," he said quietly. "Honesty. I appreciate that." She paused, then added, "I lost my mother when I was 16. Cancer. I watched her fade for 2 years before she finally let go. I understand what it's like to lose someone and not know how to keep living it afterward. Yet you seem to have managed." "I chose to," she said, "every day, even when I didn't want to, especially then." They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the party fading into background static. Marco realized Rocco had moved discreetly away, giving them space. "Why approach me?" Marco asked. "Most people in this room avoid me like disease." "Because you looked like you were planning your escape route," Amber said with a slight smile. "And because I've learned that the most dangerous people are often just the most wounded. I wondered which one you were." "And your conclusion?" "Still forming." She held his gaze. "But I think there's more to you than the stone face and the scary reputation." "Disappointed?" "Intrigued," she corrected. They talked for 20 minutes. Not about his business or her charities, but about meaningless things. Books they had read, places they had traveled before life became complicated. The desert at sunrise. Small, safe topics that required no vulnerability. When she finally excused herself, pleading an early meeting the next morning, Marco found himself watching her leave. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she had looked at him and seen something other than the ghost he had become. Interesting woman, Rocco said when Marco rejoined him. Yes. Father Dominic would approve. Marco shot him a look but said nothing. He stayed for the required hour, then left without fanfare, Rocco driving him back through the desert night toward the mansion he still could not quite call home. For the next week, Marco tried to forget the conversation, but Amber Justine's words kept returning. About choosing to live, about making the decision daily, especially when you did not want to. He found himself researching her through the discreet channels available to him. Rocco brought files, photographs, background information compiled efficiently and thoroughly. Amber Justine, 32 years old, born to wealth but not idle with it. 3 successful charities focused on children's welfare, education, and healthcare. No criminal record, no scandals, no hidden agendas. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who had experienced loss and chosen to channel it into something meaningful. She's clean, boss, Rocco confirmed. No connections to any organization, no debts, no leverage points, just a do-gooder with money and time to spare. Marco studied the photograph on top of the file. It showed Amber at a charity event, surrounded by children, her smile genuine and unguarded. Set up a meeting, he said quietly. What kind of meeting? Private, dinner, somewhere neutral. Marco paused. No, not neutral. Santoro's, upstairs. Let her see exactly who she'd be dealing with. Rocco nodded and left to make the arrangements. 3 days later, Amber Justine stood in the doorway of Marco's private dining room above the restaurant. She wore a simple black dress and a cautious expression, her eyes taking in the dark wood paneling, the amber lighting, the single table set for 2 in the center of the room. This is either very romantic or very threatening, she said, stepping inside. I haven't decided which. Perhaps both, Marco replied, echoing their earlier conversation. He gestured to the chair across from him. Thank you for coming. Your invitation was intriguing, though I'll admit I almost declined. She sat, graceful and composed. Private dinner with Marco Santoro in his restaurant doesn't exactly scream safe choice. Yet you came anyway. I'm practical, not stupid. I brought insurance. She pulled out her phone, showed him a text message, ready to send with one tap. My assistant knows where I am. If I don't check in within 2 hours, she calls the police. Marco's lips twitched. Smart. Necessary. She set the phone down, face up on the table. So, why am I here? I have a proposition, Marco said. He poured wine for both of them, expensive vintage from his private collection. It's unconventional, and I'll understand if you refuse, but I'm asking you to hear me out before making your decision. I'm listening. Marco took a breath. He had rehearsed this conversation 100 times in his mind, weighing each word, preparing for every possible reaction. Now, sitting across from this practical, cautious woman, the rehearsed words seemed inadequate. I need to build a family again, he said finally. Not to replace the one I lost. That's impossible. But to honor them by continuing to live in a meaningful way. Amber's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened with interest. I'm not offering romance, Marco continued. I'm not capable of that anymore, but I'm offering partnership, security, purpose, a chance to build something real from the broken pieces we're both carrying. You want to marry me? It was not a question. Yes. Why me? Amber asked directly. You could have any woman in this city, younger, more connected, more willing to overlook what you do in the shadows. Because you're not impressed, Marco said. Because you saw me at that fundraiser and didn't flinch. Because you've experienced real loss and came out the other side still capable of caring about things. Because you're practical enough to understand what I'm actually offering. Which is? An arrangement, Marco said. A marriage of mutual benefit. You get security, resources to expand your charity work, protection in a world that can be dangerous for women with wealth and influence. I get a partner willing to help me rebuild something that resembles a life, eventually children, a family. Amber was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the stem of her wine glass. "You're serious," she said finally, completely. "And you think I would agree to this because—" "Because you're alone too," Marco said quietly. "Because despite all your work and your success, you go home to an empty penthouse every night. Because you've built walls around your heart, just like I have, for different reasons, but with the same result. Because maybe we could help each other remember what it feels like to not be alone." The truth of his words hung in the air between them. Amber looked away first, staring at the amber light flickering in the lamp beside them. "This is insane," she said. "Yes. I barely know you. That can be remedied. You're asking me to marry a man I met once, have dinner with once, and commit to building a life with him despite knowing almost nothing about what that life actually entails." "Yes," Marco agreed. "I am." Amber turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "And the children? How exactly do you propose we have children in a loveless marriage?" "Surrogacy, adoption, whatever you prefer. I'm not asking for physical intimacy you're not willing to give. I'm asking for partnership." "How romantic," she said dryly. "I told you I wasn't offering romance. You certainly weren't lying about that." She picked up her wine glass, took a slow sip, thinking, what would this marriage actually look like, day to day? Separate wings of my estate, public appearances together when necessary, collaboration on charitable work, which I would fund. Eventually, when we're both ready, children raised in a stable home by two parents committed to their welfare. "And your business?" Amber asked. "The parts you don't talk about?" "Remain separate. You would be protected from that world. What I do to maintain my organization would never touch you or any children we have." "You can't guarantee that." "No," Marco admitted, "but I can promise to try. And I can promise that, unlike 10 years ago, I know now what I'm risking. I wouldn't make that mistake again." Amber was silent for so long that Marco thought she would refuse. He waited, letting her think, giving her space to process the impossible offer he had just made. Finally, she spoke. "I need time to think about this." "Of course. And I need honesty, complete honesty, about what you do, who you are, what this life would actually entail." "You'll have it. And I need to know why you really chose me," Amber said, her eyes locking onto his. "The real reason, not the practiced answer." Marco held her gaze and for the first time in 10 years, let someone see past the careful walls he had built. "Because you reminded me what it feels like to be seen," he said quietly. "At that fundraiser, you looked at me and saw a person. Not a reputation, not a ghost, not a cautionary tale. Just a man, a broken man, but still a man. And for 20 minutes talking to you by now, I remembered what it felt like to be human." The vulnerability in his voice surprised even himself. Amber's expression softened, just slightly, and he saw something like understanding in her eyes. "That's the real answer," she said. "Yes," she stood, gathering her phone and purse. "I'll give you my answer within a week. That's all I ask." At the door, she paused and looked back at him. "Marco?" "Yes?" "Thank you for being honest, even when it hurt." Then she was gone, leaving him alone in the amber light with the echo of possibilities he had not allowed himself to imagine in a decade. Rocco appeared in the doorway minutes later. "How did it go?" "I don't know," Marco admitted, "but at least she didn't refuse outright. That's something." Marco looked down at his hands, at the gold wedding band he still wore. Elena would have liked Amber, he thought. She would have approved of the directness, the strength, the refusal to be intimidated. "Boss," Rocco said quietly. "I think," Marco said slowly, "I might have just taken the first step toward her actually living again. Father Dominic will be pleased." "Don't tell him yet," Marco said. "She might still say no." But as he sat alone in that private room with the restaurant humming below and the desert stars bright beyond the windows, Marco allowed himself something he had not permitted in years. Hope. Small, fragile, terrifying, but real. And for now, that was enough. 6 days passed in careful silence. Marco did not contact Amber, and she did not reach out to him. He went through his routines, attending to business with the same mechanical efficiency that had carried him through the last decade. But something had shifted. The possibility of change, however small, had cracked the foundation of his carefully controlled existence. On the seventh day, his phone rang. An unknown number. Mr. Santoro, Amber's voice came through clear and composed. I have my answer. Marco's hand tightened on the phone. I'm listening. Meet me tomorrow, same place, same time. We'll discuss the terms. The line went dead before he could respond. Rocco, who had been standing near the window, turned with raised eyebrows. She said yes? She said we'll discuss terms, Marco corrected. That's not the same thing. But it's not no. No, Marco agreed, a strange feeling rising in his chest. It's not no. The next evening, Amber arrived at Santoro's precisely on time. She wore navy blue this time, simple and professional, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she meant business. Marco met her at the entrance to the private room, and they climbed the stairs in silence. Once seated, Amber pulled out a leather folder and set it on the table between them. I spent the last week thinking, she said without preamble, and researching. I know more about you now than you probably wanted me to know. And yet you're here. I'm here because I'm practical, not because I'm naive. She opened the folder. I have conditions. If you can agree to them, I'll accept your proposal. If not, we part ways now and never speak of this again. Marco nodded. I'm listening. First, Amber began, her tone businesslike, I want complete financial independence. My charities remain mine, funded by my money, run by my staff. I won't be beholden to you financially. Agreed. Second, separate wings of the estate. You mentioned this, but I need it formalized. My space is my space. You don't enter without invitation. Agreed. Third, children. I can't have them naturally. Endometriosis discovered in my 20s. Surrogacy would be our only option. I need time before we go down that path. At least a year to establish whether this arrangement can actually work. Marco nodded slowly. That's reasonable. Fourth, honesty. Complete honesty about your business, your past, your expectations. I won't live with lies, even comfortable ones. You'll have it. Amber looked up from her notes, her eyes searching his face. And fifth, the most important one, your children's rooms, the ones you keep locked. Marco's expression hardened. What about them? Eventually they'll need to be opened. Not emptied, not erased, but opened. If we're going to build a family, we can't do it in a house that's still a shrine to grief. Your children deserve to be remembered, but not by locking their rooms like tombs. The words hit harder than Marco expected. His instinct was to refuse, to tell her those rooms were not negotiable. But he forced himself to really hear what she was saying. She was not asking him to forget. She was asking him to remember differently. Not immediately. He said finally, his voice tight. But eventually, when I'm ready. When we're ready, Amber corrected gently. I won't push, but I won't pretend they don't exist either. Is that acceptable? Marco was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Yes. Amber closed her folder. Then I accept your proposal. The words hung in the air between them, impossibly large. Marco had expected relief, perhaps satisfaction. Instead, he felt only a strange vertigo, as if he had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to discover whether he would fly or fall. We should make this legal quickly, Amber continued, back to business. Small ceremony, minimal guests. Father Dominic can officiate, if you trust him. I do. No engagement period, no public announcement until after. Just quiet, efficient, done. You've thought this through. I've thought of little else for the past week, Amber admitted. She reached across the table, offering her hand. Partners? Marco looked at her outstretched hand. This woman who had agreed to marry a broken stranger, to build something impossible from fractured pieces. He took her hand, her skin warm against his. Partners, he agreed. They were married 3 weeks later in the private chapel on the Santoro estate. Father Dominic officiated, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes bright with something that might have been hope. Rocco and Enzo served as witnesses, both men standing stone-faced in their dark suits. Amber's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Claire, stood as the only guest on her side. The ceremony was brief, practical, stripped of romance or pretense. They exchanged simple gold bands. Marcos went on his right hand, his left still occupied by Elena's ring. Amber noticed but said nothing. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Father Dominic concluded. He paused, then added gently, you may kiss the bride if you wish. Marco and Amber looked at each other. After a moment, she stepped forward and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to his cheek. Thank you, she whispered. He did not know if she was thanking him for the restraint or the opportunity. Perhaps both. That evening, Amber moved into the east wing of the mansion. Marco showed her to her rooms personally, Rocco following with her luggage. This is your space, Marco said, opening the door to a suite that had been hastily but expensively prepared. Everything has been arranged according to your specifications. If you need anything changed, tell Mrs. Chen. Amber stepped inside, taking in the sitting room, the bedroom beyond, the private terrace overlooking the desert. It's beautiful. The west wing is mine, Marco continued, keeping his voice neutral. There's a shared living area downstairs for when we need to maintain appearances. The kitchen, dining room, and library are communal. Everything else is separate. In the locked rooms? Marco's jaw tightened. Second floor, between the wings. You'll know them when you see them. I won't touch them, Amber said quietly. Not until you're ready. He nodded and turned to leave, then paused. Amber? Yes? Thank you for doing this. I know it's unconventional, possibly insane. We're both a little insane, she replied with a slight smile. Otherwise, we wouldn't have agreed to any of this. The first weeks of their marriage unfolded in careful routine. They took breakfast together in the formal dining room, reading newspapers and making polite conversation. They attended charity events as a couple, Marco in his dark suits, Amber in elegant gowns, presenting a united front to the world that whispered about the unexpected marriage. At home, they maintained their separate spaces. Amber worked on her charities from her suite. Marco conducted his business from Santoro's, or the study in his wing. They were cordial, professional, distant. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance began to close. It started with small things. Marco noticed Amber preferred tea to coffee in the mornings. She noticed he always wore the same gold watch, a gift from Elena. He began leaving the morning paper's art section at her place setting. She began asking about his day, real questions that expected real answers. One evening, 3 weeks into the marriage, Marco found Amber in the library. She sat curled in one of the leather chairs, reading by lamplight, a blanket across her lap. May I join you? He asked from the doorway. She looked up, surprised but not displeased. Of course, it's your house. Our house, he corrected, settling into the chair across from her. They sat in comfortable silence, both reading, the only sound the occasional turn of a page or the crackle from the fireplace. After an hour, Amber spoke. This is nice, she said. I didn't expect nice. Neither did I. We're doing better than I thought we would, she admitted, at this whole marriage thing. Low expectations help. She laughed softly, and the sound did something strange to Marco's chest. It had been so long since he had heard genuine laughter in this house. Can I ask you something? Amber said, setting her book aside. Yes. The rooms, the locked ones, how long have they been sealed? Marco's hands tightened on his book. 10 years, since right after the funeral. Have you opened them? Even once? No. Why not? He was quiet for a long time, searching for words that could explain the inexplicable. Because opening them means accepting they're really gone. As long as those rooms stay frozen exactly as they were, I can pretend they're just away. Just visiting somewhere, not buried on the hill. Amber's eyes filled with understanding and sadness. Oh, Marco. I know it's not rational, he said. I know they're gone. I stood at their graves, I watched them lower the caskets. But those rooms are the last place they were alive. The last space that still holds their presence. I can't let that go. I'm not asking you to let them go, Amber said gently. I'm asking you to let them rest. There's a difference. Marco looked away, unable to meet her eyes. I don't know how. Then maybe, she said carefully, we learn together. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. When you're ready, I'll be there. You won't have to do it alone. The offer hung between them, tender and terrifying. Marco felt something crack in his chest, some carefully maintained wall beginning to crumble. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "Help me face something so painful." "Because that's what partners do," Amber said simply, "and because I think you've been alone with this grief for too long. Everyone needs someone to lean on sometimes." "I don't know how to lean." "Then I'll teach you." She smiled, charmed but genuine. "I'm good at teaching stubborn men how to be human again." Despite himself, Marco felt his lips twitch. "Are you calling me stubborn?" "I'm calling you terrified," she said. "But that's okay, I am too. We can be terrified together." A month later, late one night when sleep would not come, Marco found himself standing outside the locked rooms. His hand rested on the doorknob, not turning it, just touching. He had done this hundreds of times over the years. Come to this spot, stood in silence, then walked away. Tonight, Amber appeared at the end of the hallway. She wore a robe over her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Can't sleep?" she asked quietly. "Never can on Thursdays," he admitted. Thursday was the day of the accident. She moved down the hallway until she stood beside him. She did not touch him, did not speak, just stood there in silent solidarity. "I used to think if I kept everything exactly the same, they might somehow come back," Marco said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That if I preserved their world perfectly enough, the universe would realize it made a mistake and return them to me. That's not how it works." "I know." He looked at the locked door. "But knowing and accepting are different things." "Yes," Amber agreed, "they are." They stood together in the dim hallway, two people joined by legal documents and mutual brokenness, learning slowly what it meant to not be alone. "When you're ready," Amber said finally, "to open these doors, I'll help you. But not tonight. Tonight, let's just acknowledge they're here, that they mattered, that they still matter." Marco nodded, not trusting his voice. After a moment, Amber took his hand. Not romantically, just a simple gesture of human connection. He did not pull away. "Come on," she said gently. "I'll make tea. We can sit in the library until the sun comes up if you want. We don't have to talk. We just don't have to be alone." And for the first time in 10 years, Marco let someone lead him away from the locked doors. Let someone offer comfort he had convinced himself he did not deserve. Let someone see him at his most vulnerable and stay anyway. In the library, Amber made tea while Marco built up the fire. They settled into their respective chairs, blankets and books, the night stretching, quiet and safe around them. "Thank you," Marco said eventually. "For what?" "For not trying to fix me, for just being here." Amber looked at him over the rim of her teacup. "You're not broken, Marco. You're grieving. There's a difference, but they're in. It doesn't feel different." "I know," she said, "but it is. Broken things can't be repaired. Grieving hearts can learn to beat again. It just takes time and patience and sometimes another person willing to sit in the dark with you until dawn." Marco watched her in the firelight, this practical woman who had agreed to an impossible arrangement and was somehow making it work through simple, quiet presence. "I think," he said slowly, "I might have made the right choice. Asking you." "I think," Amber replied with a gentle smile, "we both made the right choice, even if we didn't know it at the time." They sat together through the night, two strangers becoming something more. Not lovers, not yet, but companions, partners, two people who had agreed to build something new. From broken pieces, learning one quiet evening at a time what it meant to Trebasu. Outside, the desert stars wheeled overhead, patient and eternal. And inside, in a house that had known too much silence, the first fragile sounds of healing began to echo through the halls. It was not love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that might someday become love. And for now, that was more than enough. 6 months into their arrangement, the word marriage began to feel less like a legal contract and more like a living thing. Marco and Amber had developed routines that felt almost natural. Morning tea together, evenings in the library, occasional dinners where conversation flowed easier than either had expected. But they still slept in separate wings, still maintained careful boundaries, still treated their partnership as exactly what they had agreed it would be, an arrangement. Until the night everything shifted. Marco returned home late from Santoros, exhausted from a meeting that had turned tense. Territory disputes, the kind that required his particular brand of quiet intimidation to resolve. He wanted nothing more than solitude and whiskey. Instead, he found Amber in the kitchen, baking at midnight. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked from the doorway. She looked up, flour dusting her hands and a strand of hair falling across her face. "I bake when I'm thinking too hard. It's either this or pace the halls like a ghost." Marco moved into the kitchen, loosening his tie. "What are you thinking about?" Amber was quiet for a moment, focusing intently on the dough she was kneading. Then, without looking up, she said, "Children." The word landed heavily between them. "We agreed to wait a year," Marco said carefully. "It's been 6 months. I'm not asking to start now. I'm just thinking about it, about what it would mean." She finally looked up at him. "Do you still want children, Marco? Really? Or was that just something you said to make this arrangement sound more like a real marriage?" He pulled out one of the kitchen chairs and sat, watching her work. The question deserved honesty. "I want it," he said finally, "and it terrifies me." "Why?" "Because I failed to protect them before." The words came out raw. "Sophia and Luca Jr. were in that car because of me, because of what I am. Someone wanted to hurt me, and they used my children to do it. How do I risk that again? How do I bring new life into a world where I can't guarantee their safety?" Amber set down the dough and wiped her hands on a towel. She moved to sit across from him, her expression serious but not pitying. "You can't guarantee anyone's safety," she said. "Not in your world or mine. Bad things happen to good people every single day. The accident that took my mother, the drunk driver who hit Elena's car, the random violence that destroys families. We can't control any of it. Then how do we justify taking the risk?" "By choosing to live despite the fear," Amber said firmly. "By refusing to let tragedy win. By building something beautiful in defiance of all the terrible things that could happen. That's not naivety, Marco. That's courage." "I don't feel courageous. You're sitting here discussing having children despite carrying 10 years of grief. That's the definition of courage." She reached across the table, her hand settling over his. "They would want you to try. Sophia and Luca Jr. They would want you to be a father again, to love again, to live." Marco looked down at their joined hands. Her touch had become familiar over the months, a comfort he had not expected to find. "What about you?" he asked. "Why do you want this?" "Honestly?" Amber withdrew her hand and leaned back. "Because I've spent years building charities that help children while telling myself I didn't need my own, that I could fulfill that maternal instinct through my work. But it's not the same. And when I agreed to marry you, I told myself it was just practical, just a partnership. But somewhere along the way, I started wanting more. More. A real family," she said simply. "Not just an arrangement that looks like a marriage from the outside. Something genuine. Children who call this house home. A life that matters beyond business and charity work." "You want to make this real," Marco said, understanding dawning. "Don't you?" He thought about the past 6 months, about mornings over tea, evenings in the library, quiet conversations that had slowly become less guarded, about how Amber's presence had begun to soften the edges of his grief, not erasing it, but making it more bearable. "Yes," he admitted, "I think I do." Amber's expression brightened, hope flickering in her eyes. "Then let's talk about next steps. I've already spoken with fertility specialists. Given my endometriosis, surrogacy is our only option. I have a list of agencies, recommendations, legal considerations." "You've done your research." "I always do." She smiled slightly. "The question is whether you're ready, really ready, not for the idea of children, but for the reality, the case, the vulnerability, the fear that comes with loving something that much." Marco was quiet for a long time. He thought about Sophia's laugh, Luca Jr.'s small hand in his, the way fatherhood had filled his life with purpose and joy before it was ripped away. The 10 years he had spent believing he would never feel that again. "I don't know if I'm ready," he said honestly, "but I don't think I'll ever be completely ready. Maybe we just have to take the leap and hope we're strong enough to catch each other if we fall." That's very poetic for a man who claims to have no romance left. "I have moments." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked the desert. If we do this, Amber, we do it right. Not as an arrangement, but as partners who are choosing to build a family together. That means opening doors I've kept closed, facing things I've avoided, actually living in this house instead of just existing in it. The children's rooms, Amber said softly. Yes. Are you ready for that? Marco's hands clenched briefly, then released. No, but you were right months ago. They deserve better than being locked away like a shrine. If we're going to bring new children into this house, we need to make peace with the old grief first. Amber stood and moved to join him at the window. They stood side by side, looking out at the star-filled desert sky. We can do this together, she said, one step at a time. No rushing, no pushing, just forward movement, however slow. When did you become so wise? When I agreed to marry a stubborn, grief-stricken crime boss and decided to make it work. She bumped his shoulder lightly. You bring out my philosophical side. Despite himself, Marco smiled. That's a side effect I can live with. They talked through the night, making plans. They would wait another 2 months, giving them 8 months of marriage before beginning the surrogacy process. In the meantime, Marco would work on opening the locked rooms, not emptying them, just opening them, letting light and air back into spaces that had been sealed for too long. And they would gradually stop maintaining such rigid boundaries in their own relationship. Start sharing more than just morning tea and evening books. Begin building the kind of partnership that could sustain the weight of new life. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday evening when the grief was usually heaviest, Marco stood outside the locker rooms with Amber at his side. He held the key in his hand, the metal warm from his grip. We don't have to do this tonight, Amber said quietly. Yes, Marco said, we do. If I wait for when I'm ready, I'll never do it. He unlocked the first door, Sophia's room. The door swung open with a soft creak and stale air rushed out. Marco stood frozen in the doorway, unable to step inside. The room was exactly as she had left it 10 years ago. Pink walls with hand-painted butterflies, dolls arranged carefully on shelves, a drawing table covered in crayon masterpieces, the small bed with its princess comforter. Amber's hand found his, squeezing gently. Breathe, she reminded him. He forced air into his lungs and took one step forward. Then another. The floor creaked under his weight, and dust motes danced in the light from the hallway. She loved butterflies, Marco said, his voice rough. Used to catch them in the garden and then cry when she had to let them go. Elena would explain that butterflies needed to be free to be beautiful. Sophia would nod like she understood, then cry anyway. She sounds wonderful. She was. Marco moved to the drawing table, his fingers brushing over a crayon portrait. This was supposed to be me. She said I looked grumpy even in pictures, so she gave me a smile, a big one with all the teeth. Amber looked at the cheerful, somewhat deranged smile Sophia had drawn, and despite the grief thick in the air, she laughed softly. She had your number. They moved through the room slowly, Marco sharing memories as they went. The doll Elena had bought for Sophia's 5th birthday, the butterfly mobile that still hung over the bed, the tiny shoes lined up in the closet, impossibly small. After an hour, they moved to Luca Jr.'s room. It was harder somehow, seeing his son's toys untouched, his clothes still folded, the race car bed waiting for a child who would never sleep there again. He wanted to be like me when he grew up, Marco said, standing in the middle of the room. God help him. He actually looked up to me, thought I was some kind of hero. To him, you were, Amber said. I was his father. I should have kept him safe. You couldn't have known someone would plant a bomb in that car. You can't carry that guilt forever, Marco. Can I? He turned to look at her, and his eyes were wet. It was meant for me, Amber. That bomb, that attack, all of it was aimed at me. They died because I exist. Amber moved to him, taking both his hands in hers. They died because someone evil made an evil choice. That's not on you. You've been punishing yourself for 10 years for something you couldn't control. When does it end? I don't know. Then let me decide, she said firmly. It ends now, right here in this room with me standing beside you. You don't have to stop grieving. You don't have to stop missing them. But you do have to stop destroying yourself over it. Marco's careful control finally shattered. The tears came, silent and wrenching, 10 years of held grief finally breaking free. Amber pulled him close, and he buried his face in her shoulder, his body shaking. She held him, one hand stroking his back, murmuring soft words of comfort. She did not tell him to stop crying, did not rush him through it. She just held him while he finally let himself break. When the storm finally passed, they sank down together onto the floor of Luca Jr.'s room, backs against the race car bed. Marco's face was wet, his composure in ruins, but something inside him felt lighter, cleaner, as if a wound that had festered for years had finally been lanced. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely. "Don't be. You needed that. I've never let anyone see me like that." "Then I'm honored to be the first." Amber's head rested against his shoulder. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Marco. Not with me." They sat in silence for a while, the house settling around them. "I want to do this," Marco said finally. "The surrogacy, the children, building a real family with you. Not as an arrangement anymore, but as something genuine." "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be about anything." He turned his head to look at her. "You've become important to me, Amber. More important than I expected. More than I thought I could feel again." "I care about you too," she admitted. "More than is probably wise for a practical arrangement. So we're both fools." "Apparently," she smiled. "At least we're fools together." The next day, they contacted the surrogacy agency. Within weeks, they had been matched with a surrogate, a kind young woman named Jessica, who had carried 2 successful pregnancies before, and approached the process with professionalism and warmth. The embryo creation process began. Marco and Amber gave their genetic material, and the clinic worked its science. 3 embryos were created, and after consultation with the doctors, they made the decision to implant all 3. "It's unlikely all 3 will take," the doctor explained, "but it increases our chances of at least 1 successful pregnancy." The implantation was performed 2 months later. Jessica was healthy, optimistic, and comfortable with the process. Marco and Amber waited, trying not to hope too much, trying not to imagine failure. 2 weeks later, Jessica called with news. The pregnancy test was positive. They would need to wait another few weeks to confirm how many embryos had successfully implanted. Marco took the news with characteristic control, but Amber saw the way his hands trembled slightly when he set down the phone. "It's really happening," he said. "Yes." "What if I can't do this? What if I fail them like I failed Sophia and Luca Jr.?" Amber crossed to him, taking his face in both her hands. "Listen to me. You didn't fail your children. You loved them completely, and they knew it. That's what matters. And these new children will know it too. We'll make sure of it together." At the 6-week ultrasound, they discovered Jessica was carrying triplets. All 3 embryos had successfully implanted. Marco sat in stunned silence as the doctor showed them 3 tiny heartbeats on the screen. "3, he finally said. "Triplets." "Is that okay?" Jessica asked, concerned by his reaction. "I know it's more than you expected." "It's perfect," Marco said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's terrifying and overwhelming and perfect." That evening, they sat on the terrace of the mansion, watching the sun set over the desert. The news of triplets had filled the house with a strange energy, a mixture of excitement and fear. "3 children," Amber said wonderingly. "Can you imagine?" "Barely. It was hard enough imagining one. We're going to need to convert more rooms, hire more staff, baby-proof everything." She laughed, a sound of pure joy mixed with panic. "We're completely unprepared." "We have time," Marco said. 7 months to figure it out. 7 months to learn how to be parents together. He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I couldn't do this without you. You know that, right? This leap, this risk, this possibility of joy. I'd still be locked in those rooms if you hadn't walked into my life." "We saved each other," Amber said simply. "That's what partners do." As the weeks passed and Jessica's pregnancy progressed smoothly, Marco began to transform. The man who had spent 10 years locked in grief started to open. He smiled more, laughed occasionally, began making plans that extended beyond the immediate moment. He and Amber started preparing the nursery in what had once been a sealed hallway between their separate wings. They painted walls, assembled cribs, debated names late into the night. Chloe, Amber suggested one evening. For a girl, it means blooming. And for another girl, if we have two? Marco asked. Claire, it means clear, bright, light after darkness. And if we have a boy? Noah, Amber said, for the promise of peace after the flood. Marco looked at her, this woman who had somehow become his anchor, his hope, his possibility of redemption. You're naming our children after transformation, he said, after moving from darkness to light. Aren't we all transforming? She asked, becoming something new from what we were? He pulled her close, and for the first time, it felt natural, not like an arrangement or a contract, but like love slowly taking root in soil that had been barren for too long. I love you, he said quietly. The words surprised him as much as they surprised her. I didn't plan to, didn't think I could, but somehow you made it possible. Amber's eyes filled with tears. I love you too, even though you're stubborn and guarded and convinced you don't deserve happiness. Maybe I don't. Maybe none of us do, she said, but we choose it anyway. We choose love and hope and the terrifying possibility of joy. That's what makes us brave. They stood together on the terrace, two people who had found each other in grief and built something beautiful from the broken pieces. Below them, the desert stretched endless and patient, and above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky. In 7 months, their house would fill with the cries of 3 new lives. The silence that had ruled for 10 years would be shattered completely. And Marco Santoro, the man who had believed his heart died with his first family, would learn that love had not ended. It had only been waiting, patient and persistent, for someone brave enough to let it grow again. For now, he held Amber close and let himself feel something he had not felt in a decade. Hope. Pure, terrifying, beautiful hope. And it was enough. The call came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in late spring. Marco jolted awake at the sound of his phone, his hand reaching for it automatically. Beside him, Amber stirred. Somewhere during the pregnancy months, she had started sleeping in his room more often than her own, their careful boundaries eroding into something that felt like a real marriage. Mr. Santoro? Jessica's voice came through, excited and slightly breathless. It's time. The contractions started an hour ago. The doctor says to meet them at the hospital. Marco was out of bed before she finished speaking. We're on our way. Amber was already moving, pulling on clothes with practiced efficiency despite the sleep still clinging to her eyes. They had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, planned every detail. But now that it was actually happening, Marco felt completely unprepared. Rocco had the car ready by the time they reached the front entrance, the black Alfa Romeo idling in the pre-dawn darkness. The drive to the hospital took 20 minutes. Marco's hands clenched white-knuckled on his knees the entire time. Breathe, Amber reminded him, taking his hand. Everything is going to be fine. You don't know that. I choose to believe it, she said firmly, and so should you. At the hospital, they were directed to a private waiting area Jessica had requested. The surrogate had been adamant that Marco and Amber be present for the birth, close enough to meet their children within moments of their arrival. The next hours unfolded in a blur of waiting and worry. Nurses came and went with updates. Jessica was progressing well. The baby's heartbeats were strong. Everything was proceeding normally. Normally. The word should have been comforting. Instead, Marco kept thinking about another hospital, another set of monitors, another night when normal had shattered into nightmare. Stop, Amber said, reading his expression. This is not that night. These babies are not Sophia and Luca Jr. You're allowed to be happy without guilt. I don't know how to separate the two. Then fake it until you figure it out. She squeezed his hand. For them, they deserve a father who's present from the moment they take their first breath. At 7:43 in the morning, a nurse appeared with a smile that made Marco's heart stop. Mr. and Mrs. Santoro, would you like to meet your children? They were led into the delivery room where Jessica lay exhausted but beaming. 3 incubators stood nearby, each containing a tiny, perfect human being. They're healthy, the doctor said, moving to stand beside the first incubator. Baby a girl, 5 pounds 2 ounces. Baby B, also a girl, 4 pounds 15 ounces. Baby Sora boss and 5 pounds even. All three are breathing well on their own, crying lustily and showing every sign of being healthy full-term babies. Marco approached the incubators slowly, afraid to hope, afraid to believe this was real. The first baby, wrapped in a pink blanket, had her tiny fists curled near her face. The second girl had wisps of dark hair and Amber's nose. The boy in the third incubator was bigger than his sisters, already looking determined even in sleep. "Would you like to hold them?" the nurse asked. Marco looked at Amber, who nodded, tears streaming down her face. Together, they each took a baby. Marco cradled the boy against his chest, feeling the tiny heartbeat against his own. Amber held the firstborn girl, cooing softly. "Hello, Chloe," Amber whispered to the baby in her arms. "We've been waiting for you." Marco looked down at his son, at the perfect features and tiny fingers that gripped his thumb with surprising strength. "Noah," he said softly. "Your name is Noah. Peace after the storm." The second girl was placed in Jessica's arms for a moment, the surrogate kissing her forehead gently before passing her to the nurse, who offered her to Marco. He shifted Noah carefully and took his second daughter, overwhelmed by the weight of 3 new lives that depended on him. "Claire," he said, his voice breaking. "You're Claire, our light." For the next hour, they took turns holding the babies, memorizing their faces, their sounds, their perfect impossibility. Jessica watched with satisfaction, knowing her work was done, that these children would go home to parents who already loved them completely. When they finally left the hospital that afternoon, 3 car seats installed in the back of the Alfa Romeo, Marco drove with exaggerated care. Every bump in the road felt like a potential disaster. Every turn required intense concentration. "They're fine," Amber said from the back seat where she sat between the car seats, watching the baby sleep. "They're not made of glass. They might as well be." "You're going to be an adorably paranoid father, aren't you?" "Probably." "Good," she said, smiling. "They'll need that." The mansion had been transformed in preparation for their arrival. The nursery was complete, 3 cribs arranged in a soft semicircle, each one painted with stars and moons. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself, preparing everything from bottles to blankets to a schedule that would help them survive the first overwhelming weeks. Even Rocco and Enzo had been recruited, both men looking utterly terrified of the 3 tiny humans now occupying their boss's home. "Just don't drop them," Rocco muttered to Enzo. "Boss will kill us if we drop them." "I'm not going to drop them," Enzo hissed back. "You're the one with the shaky hands." Marco would have found their panic amusing if he wasn't equally terrified. The first night was chaos. The babies cried in shifts, ensuring that neither Marco nor Amber got more than 20 minutes of sleep at a time. By dawn, they were exhausted, covered in various baby fluids, and completely in love. "This is insane," Marco said at 4 in the morning, rocking Noah while Amber fed Chloe and Claire slept fitfully in her crib. "This is parenting," Amber corrected with a tired smile. "Welcome back to it." The days blurred together in a haze of feedings and diaper changes and the constant background noise of at least one baby crying at any given moment. The house that had been silent for so long now pulsed with life, messy and loud and perfect. Marco took to fatherhood with a fervor that surprised even him. He learned to change diapers with military efficiency. He mastered the art of the swaddle. He discovered he could function on 2 hours of sleep as long as coffee and determination were available. Most importantly, he learned to let himself love without the paralyzing fear that had haunted him since the night he lost his first family. One evening, 2 weeks after the babies came home, Father Dominic visited. He found Marco in the nursery, all 3 babies asleep for a miraculous 15-minute window. Marco sat in the rocking chair between their cribs, just watching them breathe. "You look exhausted," Dominic observed quietly. "I am," Marco admitted, "and I've never been happier." The priest smiled, settling into the other chair in the room. "Elena and your children would be proud of you. You honored their memory by choosing to live again." "I didn't do it alone," Marco said, glancing toward the door where Amber could be heard giving instructions to Mrs. Chen about bottle preparation. "She gave me the courage to try. Love has a way of doing that. I fought it for so long, convinced myself I didn't deserve it, couldn't survive it, wouldn't find it again. And now, Marco looked at his three children, then toward the sound of Amber's voice. Now I think maybe grief and love aren't opposites. They're two sides of the same commitment. You can't grieve deeply unless you love deeply, and you can't love deeply unless you're willing to risk the grief. When did you become so philosophical? When I was too tired to maintain my defenses. Marco smiled slightly. Sleep deprivation is apparently good for emotional honesty. Father Dominic chuckled. Then these children are providing you spiritual guidance already. As if summoned by the conversation, Noah began to fuss, his small whimper quickly escalating toward a full cry. Marco stood immediately, lifting his son from the crib with practiced gentleness. Shh, little one, he murmured in Italian, the language of his childhood, his father's language. Papa's here. Everything's all right. Noah settled at the sound of his father's voice, tiny fingers curling around Marco's thumb. In their cribs, his sisters continued sleeping, blissfully unaware of their brother's brief crisis. You're a natural, Dominic observed. I'm terrified every moment of every day, Marco corrected. But I'm doing it anyway. That's all any parent can do. Amber appeared in the doorway, stopping when she saw Father Dominic. I'm sorry, I didn't know we had a visitor. I was just leaving, the priest said, standing. I wanted to see the new arrivals and make sure their father hadn't completely lost his mind yet. Only partially, Amber assured him. We're taking shifts with the sanity. After Father Dominic left, Marco and Amber stood together in the nursery, Noah sleeping against Marco's chest, both of them too exhausted to do anything but exist in the moment. Do you ever think about parallel universes? Amber asked quietly. About versions of us who made different choices? Sometimes, Marco admitted. There's a version of you who stayed locked in grief, who never opened those doors, who never took the risk. And there's a version of me who stayed safe in my work, who never agreed to marry a stranger, who never pushed you to try again. Are you regretting our choices? God, no. She leaned against him, careful not to wake Noah. I'm grateful for them, and even when I'm so tired I can barely see straight, I'm grateful. Because this, right here, this impossible Rose family we built from grief and hope and stubborn determination, this is worth every sleepless night. Marco kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with baby powder and exhaustion. I love you, he said, in case I don't say it enough between the chaos. You say it plenty, she assured him, sometimes with words, mostly with actions. The way you check on me every hour to make sure I'm okay. The way you've learned to braid Claire's non-existent hair because you're planning ahead for when she has enough. The way you sing Italian lullabies at 3 in the morning because it's the only thing that calms Chloe down. Those are just survival techniques. Those are love, Amber corrected, and they're exactly what our children need. As the weeks turned into months, the Santoro household found its rhythm. The babies grew, developing personalities that were both distinct and delightful. Chloe was serious and observant, watching everything with dark eyes that seemed to take in far more than any infant should. Claire was the smiler, charming everyone who looked at her. Noah was determined, fighting sleep and feeding with a stubbornness his father recognized. Marco reduced his involvement with the organization even further, delegating to trusted lieutenants and appearing only when absolutely necessary. His priorities had shifted completely. Business was something he did to provide for his family. His family was what he lived for. One evening, when the babies were 4 months old and finally starting to sleep in longer stretches, Marco found himself standing outside Sophia and Luca Jr.'s rooms. The doors stood open now, had been open since the night he and Amber first unlocked them. The rooms were no longer shrines but memories, honored but not worshipped. Amber found him there as she often did when the weight of the past pressed on him. Thinking about them? She asked. Always, he said, but differently now. I used to think remembering them meant staying frozen in the moment I lost them. But I'm learning it can mean carrying them forward, letting their memory be part of building something new instead of preventing it. They'd love their siblings, Amber said. Sophia would probably be bossing them around already. Luca Jr. would be trying to protect them. Yes, Marco agreed, smiling at the image. They would. Do you want to convert these rooms? Amber asked carefully, for when the triplets get older. Marco thought about it, then shook his head. No, let them stay as they are. When the babies are old enough to ask, we'll tell them about their brother and sister who came before. Make sure they know they're part of a bigger story. That's beautiful. That's survival, Marco corrected, learning to hold grief and joy in the same hands without dropping either one. On a warm summer evening, when the desert air smelled of sage and the stars were especially bright, Marco and Amber sat on the terrace watching the sunset. The babies were inside with Mrs. Chen, giving their parents a rare moment of peace. "Do you remember your proposal?" Amber asked, her head resting on Marco's shoulder. "In Santoro's restaurant, with all your careful conditions and logical reasoning? I remember thinking I was offering you a business arrangement. And look at us now." She laughed softly, completely in love, exhausted new parents, with a house full of noise and life and chaos. Hardly the practical arrangement either of us signed up for. "No," she agreed, "it's so much better." Marco turned to look at her, this woman who had walked into his darkness and refused to let him stay there, who had challenged him, supported him, loved him back to life. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For seeing past the walls, for being brave enough to push when I tried to hide, for giving me 3 reasons to keep living when I thought I had lost all my reasons 10 years ago." "You gave yourself those reasons," Amber said. "You chose to take the risk. I just walked beside you. You did more than that. You led the way when I couldn't see the path." Below them, through the open terrace doors, they could hear one of the babies starting to fuss. Mrs. Chen's soothing voice followed, calming them back to sleep. The sounds of life, constant and demanding and perfect. "We should go in," Amber said. "Rescue Mrs. Chen before all 3 wake up." "5 more minutes," Marco requested. "Just 5 minutes of peace before we return to the beautiful chaos." "Deal." They sat together watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber and deep purple. The house behind them glowed with warm light, filled with new life and new hope. Marco thought about the man he had been 10 years ago, standing in that hospital corridor believing his life was over. He thought about the decade of grief, the locked rooms, the careful numbness that had kept him functionally dead. And he thought about the choice he'd made, with Father Dominic's pushing and Amber's courage and his own desperate need for something beyond mere survival. To open the doors, to take the risk, to love again despite knowing exactly how much it could hurt to lose that love. In the end, it came down to a simple truth. Life was impossibly fragile and infinitely precious, and the only way to honor those we'd lost was to keep living as fully as possible. Sophia and Luca Jr. would never be replaced. The grief of losing them would never fully heal. But around that grief, life had grown. New love, new children, new reasons to wake up each morning and face the terrible beauty of existence. "Time's up," Amber said, standing and offering her hand. "Back to the chaos." Marco took her hand and let her pull him to his feet. "Back to the chaos," he agreed. They walked inside together toward the sound of their children's voices, toward the life they had built from impossible beginnings. The house that had once been a tomb had become a home. The man who had stopped living had learned to thrive, and the grief that had seemed endless had made space for joy. Not because grief ended, it never really did, but because love was stronger than grief, hope was more powerful than despair, and life, in all its messy, chaotic, heartbreaking beauty, was always worth choosing. Marco Santoro had learned that lesson the hard way, but he had learned it. And 3 small voices crying in the nursery were proof that some lessons, however painful, led to the most beautiful destinations. He had lost everything once, and he had survived to build everything again. Different, but no less precious. And that made all the difference.